Good morning. My name is Lorraine Jacobs, and Mark Miller and I are the co-chairs of Sunday Morning Forums. We welcome you this morning and thank you for supporting the forums. Before we begin today, I'd like to remind you that next Sunday, May 15th at 10 a.m., our topic will be Dynamic Partnerships, Common Ground Priorities, with Jennifer O'Keefe, who's the lead organizer and executive director. And this will be an in-person with Zoom backup, so we'll be back. And today, we welcome Alan Borsuk to be introduced by today's forum host, Mark Miller.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Things are much better this week, seeing as the power is on in the church. Last week, half the church was out of power. Alan Borsuk was pretty serious about going to law school in the early 70s, but decided to work for a year or two. Somehow that became 37 years at the Milwaukee Journal and Milwaukee Journal Sentinel as a reporter, columnist, and editor. Finally, in November 2009, he made it to Marquette Law School, not as a student, but as a senior fellow in law and public policy. His duties include writing for the law school faculty blog about law school programs and public policy issues, working on the Marquette Lawyer magazine and understanding research projects related to public policy. He also writes a weekly column about education, appearing Sundays in the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. During his newspaper career, Borsuk covered a wide range of subjects, including federal courts, environmental issues, Milwaukee city government, abortion, and philanthropy and foundations in Milwaukee. He covered several presidential campaigns and numerous presidential visits to Wisconsin, as well as a wide range of state political stories. So today we welcome Alan Borsuk.
I was told I could take my mask off.
Yeah, thank you.
Frankly, it's easier to understand without the mask. I'm not so sure I'm easy to understand any time, but okay. I'm pleased to be here and please come on in. People are still checking me in. The subject that I suggested we talk about within the realm of education wasn't some of the more directly political and controversial things, although maybe they are, but what's working. I'm right so much about what's not working and how difficult and how concerning the problems of education are. And nonetheless, if I have the option, I'd like to write about more positive things. I see two people sitting in front of me right here who got records of being involved so strongly in that. And the piece that I wrote that's in the newspaper today and this weekend online is a product of Dennis Conta's work going back many years involving Tenor High School, which is one of the success stories here. In fact, to some degree, you can see the whole subject and the range of the subject in three recent pieces that I wrote for the newspaper. Two of them were about a school on the northwest side called Grand Tosa Drive. And one is the piece this weekend on Tenor. Grand Tosa Drive, frankly, has been having a really pretty terrible school year. It's probably at the extreme end of what's going on, but nonetheless, the problems at Grand Tosa Drive resonate too much in too many other schools in Milwaukee. Kids are out of control, staffing is a huge problem, weak administrative leadership, no response to when parents are asked to get involved much too often, not always, but much too often. Just a whole sense that things aren't going well when it comes to the simple subject of our kids learning, growing, getting on a path to bright futures. So much so that I began hearing about this, like last October, maybe even, and in late November, 24 staff members, which is, I believe, probably about 40% of the whole staff, sent letters to the school board saying, do something, help us. We're just, every day's out of control. Frankly, when you send a letter to the school board, it becomes a public document. So at that point, I asked for I heard about this and I asked for the letters. They managed to take 3 months to fulfill that request. I had the feeling they didn't want me to read this. But eventually I did a couple pieces. So this is really deeply concerning because there are just too many kids in the city who are not on track to turn into good citizens and adults and people who can build Milwaukee the way we all want, both for themselves and for the whole enterprise of Milwaukee. And by that I mean the entire Milwaukee area, not just the city. So we've got, in fact, it's gotten worse in recent years. We've got 20% or fewer kids in Milwaukee public schools. It's not that much better in the charter and voucher private schools who are reading what the state of Wisconsin considers a proficient level. Even if you expand that to add the category they call basic, it's still only about 50%. Math is even worse. It's gotten worse during the pandemic. You could ask pretty much any educator in any school, any setting, and they'll tell you that the pandemic has taken a toll on kids educationally, socially. Mental health has been a big issue in schools for the last bunch of years, and has accelerated, of course, during the pandemic. So you got all the bad news. Tenor High School, which is what I wrote about this weekend, in many ways shows the good news, qualified by the fact that there's still a lot of room for improvement. There's still a far distance to go to get to an ideal situation. Tenor High School is part of a group of schools called Seeds of Health. Each one of them is kind of distinctive, different, really geared to the interests of kids. There are 2 campuses for Tenor High School. One of them is very close by here in the old Cathedral High School, Cathedral Square. And one of them, somewhat hilariously to me, is now in the old Milwaukee Sentinel building, which is, I spent a lot of time in that building for many, many years. And now it's like a vibrant school. I say, oh, this is just too weird to be in that space. Tenor is geared not towards the kids who are, you say, you define success only as are you going to Harvard or a 4-year university of any kind. That's good, but that's not the whole picture. And Tenor is particularly geared to kids who are probably going to go into vocational and technical education, jobs that are steady, well-paid, family supporting. The whole program of Tenor, and Dennis Counter was one of the key figures in creating the school, about 10, 12 years ago now, is that they spend, particularly their senior year, going to classes of MATC, and by the time they graduate high school, they have a high school diploma, and they're well on track to getting at least a 2-year certificate from MATC and getting into jobs. So what's the difference between an operation like Tenor and so much of what is going on in other schools in the city, in MPS, but not only in MPS. There's a lot of problems in other settings as well, and we need to be honest about that. So many things have been tried in education, nationwide, in Wisconsin, in Milwaukee, whatever arena you want to pick. So many things have been tried and just haven't moved the needle the way that everyone wanted. To name two really big ones in Milwaukee, school desegregation going back to the 1970s. Obviously a noble and worthy idea, but did it really close gaps in the big picture between Black kids and white kids, low-income kids and richer kids? Look at the reality around us and we say it wasn't the success, it didn't have the impact that the people involved hoped. It's one of the reasons why the white population in Milwaukee between 1960 and 2000 went down by 400,000 people. This is not to defend or praise this, but it's a fact. So school desegregation was a huge, you can look at it as a huge experiment in trying to change reality towards the better, and it wasn't much of a success. Then you get to school choice, starting around 1990, both in the form of private school vouchers. Milwaukee was the first place in the country, first urban setting in the country, where you could get public money to send your children to private schools. Starting in 1998, that included religious schools, and at that point the program grew rapidly. Now, roughly a quarter of all children in the city of Milwaukee who are getting publicly funded education, that public money is being used to pay for their education, are going to private schools, almost all of them religious. Another 14% or so are going to charter schools. Let's not digress into the difference between charter and voucher schools, except to say that charter schools are not religious, are generally independently run and publicly funded. The Seeds of Health schools I was mentioning are all charter schools. Well, actually, one of them is a little different category, but they're not part of regular public systems. In any case, the reason for the rise of the school choice options, one of the big underlying reasons was this was going to really spark positive change. School choice has been popular in all its forms. Almost all the programs are fully subscribed to this day. We're not going to go backwards on it. It's here to stay, whether people like it or not. And I'm just speaking as an observer and not as a partisan. But same thing as school desegregation. Did it close the gap? No. Did it move the needle? Not really. There are some outstanding schools in Milwaukee Public Schools, in the charter school sector for sure, in the private schools, the voucher schools, but there are also weak schools getting weak results that are poorly run in all of those sectors. So what are the attributes? This is something I've been trying to spend more time both thinking about and writing about. What are the attributes of a school that's succeeding? Many of them involve factors outside of the school. You can't blame educators for everything going on out there. A lot of kids, especially in a low-income setting, you'd also find it in some of the richest suburbs, are leading really troubled lives, very dysfunctional homes, unsteady and unconstructive parenting, you name it. It's tough out there to be a kid. It's tough out there to be a parent. Happy Mother's Day, by the way. One of the things to stress here is how important that role is of being a mother, a father, a good parent, and any of the many variations on that. So certainly a key ingredient is what's going on in the homes. There's no question whether we, again, I'm not here to praise it or defend it necessarily, but educational success correlates with income. Richer communities, kids are doing better than poor communities, and nothing's particularly changed that. There are rich kids who are doing terrible, there are poor kids who are doing great, so this is a generalization and not a statement of fate, but that's, what's the biggest form of school choice? It's where you buy your house, which means where you can afford to buy a house. Buying a house is a school choice program for thousands and thousands of people. You buy a house based on a school district. I want to live in Shorewood or Brookfield or Mequon or wherever it might be, because they've got good schools. Ask any real estate agent. So much of the recipe for success is outside of the school building, and it's tough to change that. I wish it could be changed. I think there's been a growing emphasis, probably nationwide and even around here, on early childhood programs and some things that would make some changes in parenting and setting up kids to do well in school before they ever walk into school or before they reach kindergarten age. But it's tough to change those things. So let me mention some of the things that still, even within these realities, can be done in a school, within the walls of the school. And I say this because I've seen them done. I haven't seen them done as often as I'd like, but you can see them out there. I mentioned some of them in this weekend's paper. Good leadership. Show me a good school, I'll show you a great principal. And there's just not enough of them. But and not all at one time. There isn't like a cookie cutter recipe that can train someone to be a good principal. I've seen good principals who were kind of like laid back schmoozer types. I've seen them who were really business people. I've seen them who were educational visionaries. One of the things they've all had in common is not their educational styles. It's their ability to bring people together, their teachers, students, parents, to create a ship that's sailing well and moving forward. So I think too little attention is paid to who's being named to head schools individually, who's being named to run schools more broadly. Leadership really makes a difference. Obviously, teachers make a difference. And it's not only the individuals, but the teaching staff as a whole. Is it stable? Are people working together? Is there a sense of community within the teachers? And in good schools, there is. That people help each other, people are supportive of each other, and frequently that they've stayed together for a few years, which is difficult in today's world. There's so much turnover in teaching ranks. And good principals tend to attract good teachers, especially when you give them a few years, that they're able to. Teachers begin to hear where it is you can work, that you'll be supported, that you'll have a good team around you, that you'll just be in a place where there's positive energy. So good leaders, good teachers, certainly clarity about what we're trying to get done here. Frankly, I've been in too many schools in the last bunch of years where I get the feeling the goal for the day is, can we make it through? Can we keep this voice down enough that, we'll be okay? You need something more than that. You need a sense of what kind of program we have. Not even so much a particular curriculum as the goals for the school. A Tanner school, high school, has clear goals. Some of the best schools in Milwaukee in general are specialty schools that do have clear ideas. They're Montessori programs, or they're language immersion programs, or they're stressing arts. I think back to schools that I've been to in years that weren't even specialty schools, but everyone just knew we're here to make kids thrive, help kids thrive. And so that sense of why are we at this dance And are we doing the dance well is important. You could put these under the label of school culture. There are just way too many schools in Milwaukee that don't have a very good culture. And there are the stars, and many of these are stars year after year. It's not a flash in the pan thing, where you can walk in and you just feel the difference. Sometimes you can feel it within 5 minutes. I wouldn't want to write a story about school being a great place because of 5 minutes, but nonetheless, and other educators have told me this, you can just, there's a positive energy. Certainly finances matter, and the state financially of schools is a constant concern. So having adequate resources is a huge, is a critical need. Do we have adequate resources these days? Obviously, you get different answers from different people, depending on whether they're in the state legislature or one thing. In many cases, it's not as bad as the biggest critics think. It's certainly not as good as some politicians think, you know. Oh, you guys are rolling in money in school. You know, teachers only work 5 hours a day for 9 months, and so on. You have more money than you need. Not true. You need resources, and it is getting tighter out there, despite the federal pandemic money, despite referendums, whatever. The state of Wisconsin has tightened up the belt on resources for the last decade. And even at this point, it's, if anything, getting tighter as inflation has accelerated. So resources matter, just having some flexibility. The sense, I've written about it, and this is my one and only contribution, I think, to dialogue about these things. A good school is a place, in my book, that has muscle and music, is the way I label it. Muscle being that's got ambitions, clear goals, and it's really in setting standards for kids. We do suffer too much in too many schools from not expecting much from kids, and kids can produce. I'm going to write a piece, I think, in the next few weeks about a suburban district that's experimenting with intentionally raising standards. They're demanding more, particularly in their science classes. They want more kids to take AP level courses on the grounds that just being exposed to better material will lead to better results, even if the kid doesn't pass, say, an advanced placement test. I think that's an interesting idea. What if we expected more? So we need muscle. We need to expect more from teachers. We need to expect more from students. We need to expect more from parents. That doesn't mean in a harsh fashion, but just to really say, we've got important things to do here, and they can be done. And to do them, an effective principle, I should add, to me, is someone, I've sometimes said, who is willing to kick people in the butt at the same time they're putting their arm around the person, saying, you know, we need to do better, but I'm here to help. Yeah, physically that's a little demanding, I agree. But you have to have ambitions, and then the kind of environment that supports working on. So that's the muscle. And the music is the culture thing I was talking about before. I don't mean only music, literal music, although that can be very important to a good school. But just the whole sense that we're singing a song here, that we've got positive energy. So if I go into a school like, well, I'll name a couple, Milwaukee College Prep, some of the specialty schools I mentioned, MPS, some of the religious schools like St. Marcus always gets attention. Bruce Guadalupe on the south side has so many years in a row of really high achievement. Are they creaming kids? Are they getting the best kids? Are they, getting a better deal than some of the other schools in the city. It's not a yes or no subject to me. There's some aspects of that are true. I think the way things have played out with the voucher program, Milwaukee Public Schools does have a disproportionate percentage of the kids in the city with major behavior problems, not including special ed needs, and kids who do have special ed needs. So MPS has some real challenges, but nonetheless, most of the best schools in town are dealing with the kids of the city and not just the cream of the kids of the city, and they're doing it well. There is such a thing as great education. I think the best thing we can do as citizens, and I'm always very eager to be, I sound like the commentator in the booth of the football telecast. I'll tell you how the game's being played, what they need to do in the second half, and what the quarterback's performance today. But I won't tell you fundamentally who I'm rooting for as far as the Packers or the Bears. But we need to, we live in such hyper-partisan times, and it's gotten worse. And education is on the front lines of that partisanship at the moment, thanks to so many forces. Oh man, and whether it's race, whether it's social issues, whether it's political polarization in general. I think we as citizens need to, I hope, calm down, take some deep breaths, be advocates for the sweeter, better side of what needs to be done in schools, the needs of kids to be nourished, to be in healthy environments, to be in places where their character can survive and grow and thrive. So we need to be a little more moderate. So many, there's such passions out there. And that includes on the left as well as on the right, although most of it's been coming from the right in more recent times. But to be advocates for kids in the best sense of the term, to create well-nourished environments. That includes the human side, teacher issues, recruiting teachers, keeping teachers, developing the best and brightest in the classrooms is a huge issue at the moment. We all need to be advocates for, everybody says, I'm in it for the kids. We have to actually, usually when I hear that, I worry that someone's not in it for the kids. But there is such a thing as being an advocate for what kids need. And the more we can be advocates for excellence, for quality, for sweetness around kids, the more we will see, I think, the more we can hope to see schools thrive and in ways that do rebuild the future of the city. So there is such a thing as success in Milwaukee. There are places you can point to and really praise as bringing out the best in both the kids and the adults who are involved. We just need more of them, and I think the path to more of them is difficult. Obviously, if it was easy, it would be traveled a lot more, but it is doable, and I think anyone who can be an advocate for some of the things, leadership, quality, support, and environment and communities around schools, any way that we can be advocates for those things, then we're really advocates for good education. I'd be eager to take comments, questions, thoughts from people.
Yes, we'd like to do, yes. I have a question.
on up and talk into the microphone, that way people at home can hear you. And then, you could even form a line there, so, Ellen will go back to the mic and share that with, everybody.
Thank you for your comments. My concern is what has happened to the state of Wisconsin since Act 10 and unions losing their ability to make an impact on advocating for children. Thank you.
That's a very important question. Act 10 to me is more complicated. The answer is more complicated than a lot of people think. The truth is that some of the biggest fans of Act 10 were school leaders all across the state, and that nobody benefited from Act 10 more, for at least for a number of years, than Milwaukee Public Schools. Why? I'm talking about dollars in this case. There really was a huge problem with fringe benefits for teachers. I mean, it just, the numbers, the economics of it were really pretty desperate. The Milwaukee School Board voted in 2009, I think it was 2009, 2008, I think it was 2008, before Act 10 to consider bankruptcy because they were going broke. So there really were things that needed to be reined in. Some of the leaders of MPS will say this privately, but they wouldn't say it publicly. So financially, and even at that time, we had said, yes, we agree, we need to have teachers take part more in pension benefits and health plans and so on, like what's going on in the rest of the world. So there's part of Act 10 that helped. The part of Act 10 that didn't help, obviously, was that it was done in a way that left huge and continuing wounds on the teaching profession. Teachers felt disrespected, to put it mildly, in very large numbers, and that hasn't really been healed. Enrollment in teaching programs went down sharply after Act 10 was passed in Wisconsin, but it also went down in all the surrounding states and to a large degree nationwide where they didn't have Act 10. So there's a lot of reasons why teaching has become a beat up profession, and I really think that's a crisis in itself. Someone sent me, a longtime teacher sent me an email a couple of months ago saying, everything you're talking about, all sorts of other issues, are really just moving the deck furniture on the Titanic. The iceberg is the whole question of teaching and the teaching profession. I agree with that largely. There's a growing teacher crisis, even in the richest, best districts in Wisconsin. They're having increasing problems filling jobs. When it gets to a place like MPS, they're having a lot of trouble filling jobs. That's one of the reasons they were having the situation they had at Grantos Drive School, is so many positions were open. The MPS budget proposed for next year calls for increasing staff in social emotional areas, as well as in music and art and such. They can fund the positions. If not at all, we're going to have anyone to take the jobs. So there is a huge teacher crisis. Unions themselves, boy, I should stay out of that. I've got a long association with unions in many ways, and I'm in favor of teachers' unions. But to be honest, a lot of times they have not been advocates for what's good for education of kids. They've been advocates for teachers, work-pay benefits, and working conditions. And so taking away the power of the union, and it also is overstated. The Milwaukee Teachers Education Association still has a lot of clout. It wasn't like they went away. They had to reconfigure what their purposes were, and they lost some staff and members and such. But in reality, the teachers' unions are still pretty significant. I wish more unions would broaden their view as to what the definition of success is. I think that would help. You know, most teachers don't leave the professional for money or benefits. They leave it over job satisfaction. They leave it over some of the things I was talking about. I had bad leadership. I wasn't supported. The kids are out of control. I just don't have any job satisfaction. And how to reconfigure schools and teaching to be a more satisfying profession is important. To make it a more respected profession broadly is important. Again, across the board economically, it's not just the low income communities. Teachers will tell you, I just don't get the support from the parents of my kids that I once did. If I call home and why can you get an earful about what's wrong with me and not what can we do to help this kid? There's just so many problems out there. In any case, Act 10 had some positive effects because it did rein in some things that were getting out of control financially. But the way the teaching profession was beaten, teachers were beaten up, talk radio and so on, was very counterproductive and still is to this day. So I agree with you.
Hey, sorry.
Thanks, I appreciate your observations, your dedication and commitment to education. I think it's one of the good things that the Journal Sentinel does to hire you and keep at it. I appreciated your observations on leadership. It comports with other, especially at the principal level, it comports with other observations I've heard from people about the importance of the principal. You didn't say anything about the role of the school board or the superintendent. So I'm wondering what your observations are about the importance of the school board and the superintendent in leadership, setting the stage, budget, all that. Thank you.
Not getting easy questions here. Oh man, there are great superintendents around the country. There aren't too many of them, but there are some. I went to a program at dare I say, Harvard. What was this? Spring of 2019. They had this small little gathering to look at what was going on in like 10 different cities, and I was asked to take part and talk about what's going on in Milwaukee. But some of the best superintendents in the country were there. This guy who was the superintendent in Miami for a number of years and just recently moved to Los Angeles, he was spectacular. What a visionary and just a ball of fire, and had a track record in Miami to show it. But I also was sitting next to a guy who was superintendent in Denver for a number of years and had a much different personality, much more lower key, much more of a team builder. So like principles that come in different flavors, except same thing, that really had his eye on goals for what was ahead. If I was going to criticize the Milwaukee School Board and the superintendent, or the last several superintendents to some degree, and I don't want to personalize it too much, but I think there's way too much, let me rephrase it, there's way too little willingness to face up to what the problems are, to talk about the real issues and needs of kids. You could go to 50 Milwaukee School Board meetings and never hear a discussion of what are we going to do about reading or math, or just in general, how do we connect kids to the kind of environment that they're gonna thrive in. So there's way too much attention to mechanics and such, and too little to the actual issue. There is a huge reading crisis in Milwaukee, and this isn't only for MPS. I mean, the test scores aren't the be all and end all, but they're supported by so many other things. If you can't read, where are you gonna go? And this is true not only if you're gonna go into academics, it's true if you're gonna be a truck driver, it's true if you're gonna be in a construction job. Almost everything requires skills these days. And they're just not facing up to their problems. So that would be my biggest problem. In places like Miami or Denver, places that have had real challenging leaders who are really challenging the system to get better. Chicago's made more improvement than Milwaukee in the last 25 years. That's demonstrable. And, you know, it's not perfect. And man, they have politics down there, but they've also had a chain of leaders, both in the school district and in the mayor's office, that's a whole other subject, who have really said, we've got to do better. So could we do that more here? Do we need to be so passive about the problems we have? We have one firebrand member on the Milwaukee School Board now who's like, we gotta do better. But she's generally being outvoted to walk on things, and I wonder if they might be better off listening to her a little more.
Good morning, I'm Sherry Briscoe, a retired public school teacher. And I've taught in about 5 or 6 different districts, and a lot of what you say has validity. But I also have a grandson who would be an ideal teacher. He's got a degree in something else with the YWCA. And then I hear them talking, and I hear my son-in-law saying, but teaching doesn't pay enough. And then I go to our local pizza place, and our waitress is a teacher. One of my questions for you is, and so I have to say I disagree with some of your comments. It is not just dissatisfaction with teaching. My other comment would be, what would happen if our public schools went away? Because many of the charter schools and the private schools, when a kid's not behaving, when he's disrupting a classroom, somehow he doesn't belong anymore, and guess who gets him? So what will we do if our public schools go away? And I'm seeing and hearing stories about they can't get teachers, the numbers are dropping. I'd like to hear your solution to that.
Another easy question. I think teachers should be paid better. I think teachers should have good benefits and such. So I'm not saying they shouldn't. I'm saying, and I think there's fairly ample research to show that the reason teachers burn out is more job satisfaction and intangibles in the job. So both are true. The future of public schools is frankly troubling. I think it's troubling, especially in Milwaukee, but it's also statewide, nationwide, maybe that the politics of the time are alarming, and so in so many ways. When the legislature did not increase the revenue cap in the budget that passed roughly a year ago, I think it was June last year, that was a really alarming statement. One of the ironies is that the people that they're hurting the most are in their own districts. That Milwaukee really did get a huge flood of federal money and passed a referendum. And money is not the biggest problem in MPS at the moment. I'm not saying the rolling in dough, but that's, but in a lot of the rural, suburban, or smaller city districts, they got zero increase in revenue. They got very little federal money. Some of them passed referendums and some haven't. They're really getting tight. If inflation's going up 5%, if you feel like you really have to give your teachers the amount that's permitted under Act 10 these days is 4.7% for next year. You have to give them 4.7% raises, but your revenue's flat. Somebody's going to pay for that. It's going to pay for it in class sizes or fewer offerings or whatever. It's not good. So I really think there is a public school crisis. I agree with that. The question of charters and vouchers taking over, I don't know the future. And in Milwaukee, I don't think that's going to happen in itself because I think the voucher program is pretty much at the max for the market. It's 25%. Not everybody wants to go to a religious school. And the charter school sector, and I say this with Dennis Kahn sitting right here, is I don't know if it's going to grow that much because, for one thing, it's politically much weaker than the voucher program. The voucher program has always had way more lobbying and power and way more connection to particularly the Republican power structure. There was a point where they had 3 former speakers of the assembly as registered lobbyists for voucher schools. The public schools aren't going to go away. Are they going to be in a position to thrive? It's much more worrisome. Does it happen that the private schools or the charter schools kick out kids and send them to public schools? That's another one of those things that's not as open and shut as either the supporters or critics would say. It does happen anecdotally. The actual numbers are very hard to prove. I've never seen proof of it happening. Milwaukee Magazine once wrote a piece about a particular school and said they're getting all these kids coming in from after Third Friday from private schools. Later on, it came out that that was actually totally not true. The piece was virtually fact-free. That the kids they were getting were all from other MPS schools. That's the biggest churn within the system. Is instability in kids' lives a huge issue? Yes. Changing schools all the time. Kids who go to 5 or 6 schools in 2 or 3 years, that's bad. It is not good for education as a whole. Sometimes it's necessary to change jobs. So instability, but it's not instability so much across sectors. It's just the facts don't really support that. That said, there is some tendency for MPS to end up with the disproportionate number of kids who are really, really challenging. And frankly, nobody, including people in MPS, but also outsiders, really have an answer to do with a lot of these kids. You know, suspensions are out, you know, really frowned on these days, but you say, we got kids who are really breaking up classes. It's a very difficult subject, and a lot more creative thinking, but also resources need to be spent on helping kids who are off track. But it's way more grays than any slam dunk yes or no answer to my experience.
Okay, wait. One more question. What is the difference in the cost to put a child in a school for delinquency or in prison, or a young adult in prison? How does that compare with the minimum pay for teachers?
Oh, well, I don't have the numbers offhand, but yeah, incarcerating kids is extremely expensive. I mean, it's what, I don't know, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year per kid. It's not happening very much though. I mean, the numbers of being incarcerated are way down. So their kids just out there in the system or out there in the city. Do we need to do better for kids overall? Absolutely. You know, I see them driving by my house all the time. I was, my particular bent of mine, I was running errands on a Sunday afternoon about 2 months ago, and I live in Sherman Park. So I wasn't too far from my house, and I came upon an intersection where there was a car on its roof, just had happened. I think it was Berlin Appleton, Berlin Lisbon, that's where it was. And as I'm at the stoplight, 2 kids come running around the corner, and a cop is chasing them with his gun out. So my first reaction was, I'm getting out of here. But my second reaction was, I bet these kids aren't doing well in school. that these are the problems right in front of us, and they're showing up on the streets. So the bottom line, do we need to do better by kids? Absolutely. Can we do better by kids? I really think so. I think there's just too little attention to what kids really need, to a vision for a system that would serve more kids better. Are we going to move the needle from here to here in a place like the city of Milwaukee? Not very likely. Why can't we move from here to here? We get from here then to here. And there are schools, there are teachers, there are classrooms where that's happening. You know, I tell people I can sum up, it's now 13 years of writing these Sunday columns for the paper in one phrase, which is, come on folks, we can do better. Can't do perfect, maybe, but we can do better. And that's in every sector. The more time I'm at this, the less interested I am in the sector wars, the more interested I am in what's going on in a particular school or for particular kids or for all kids for that matter. Anyway.
Okay, we have one question now from Jerry Frederickson. So Jerry, need to unmute yourself.
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks for recognizing us, virtual folks out here. Appreciate it. You have ties to both Marquette and the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. And my question has to do with all the trauma that kids go through in their neighborhoods constantly with all the violence they're experiencing. So, you know, how can we expect them really to perform very well in school? There was a lot of press given to a program that Mike Lavelle started. It was called SWIM, Scaling Wellness in Milwaukee. And he brought together a consortium of social service workers, therapists, university researchers, nonprofits, criminal justice, health representatives. All these people met for quite a long period of time to resolve this trauma in all these kids that are experiencing. And I haven't heard much about it for the last couple of years. And I thought maybe with your connections with the paper and Marquette, that do you know if this has gained any traction? Is it successful in any way?
You way overestimate my connections. Connections to nobody. That's a really good question. I haven't heard anything about SWIM in quite a while. I think the pandemic was a big setback for any efforts like that, because they had a conference at the Pfizer Forum just before the pandemic that had like 8,000 people involved or something over a couple of days. I was at it for a little while, and you just weren't seeing that kind of thing. So I really don't know whether some of those efforts have just entirely stopped or kind of on hiatus, but yes, there's less of that organized activity. On the other hand, I think the subject as a whole of the social emotional needs, the mental health needs of kids, just creating a better environments for kids has made some progress. it certainly gets way more attention. It's also getting way more political blowback now. One of the most inexplicable things in America to me at the moment is the current attacks from some quarters, not so much around here, but in the South, that social emotional needs of kids are somehow related to critical race theory and are basically some kind of socialist plot. I said, oh man, have you been talking to kids? Kids have social emotional needs and schools need to deal with them. You cannot succeed in the tangibles in school unless you're succeeding in the intangibles. You know, that you have some sense of your future, some sense of optimism, some sense of why it's a good idea to work in school. It's really weird stuff to me. So I think the subject as a whole is making progress. Organizations like what once was called St. Emilian's became St. A's, and now it's recently became Well Points, have actually expanded and such. So there's some progress, but Marcia Spector, the head of the Seeds of Health schools that I was talking about before, said to me last week, and she started out running an alternative school, largely focusing on teenage parents on the South Side. It's now called Grandview High School. And she said the situation of teenage parents in Milwaukee has improved substantially from where it was, say, 25 years ago. But the mental health needs of kids as a whole have gotten much worse. So that's what they're dealing with more and more in a school like Grandview is kids with mental needs. The need is huge. The pandemic has only made it existed before the pandemic. It was getting more attention before the pandemic. Pandemic has made it worse. And that's true for little kids, you know, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and it's true for high school kids.
I think we had one more question from Dennis.
Yes, this is kind of following along on Jerry's question and kind of your answer here, but I know a young man who is interning, teaching in the Milwaukee public school system. And he was telling me about a class that he had last week that he was just totally bummed out with. There were two kids in class, very disruptive, and it basically disrupted the whole class. And he didn't really know how to deal with it. He didn't get help from his supervisor or teacher that was above him. And he claims that he didn't get that much training in when he was training to be a teacher on how to deal with those sorts of things. And then I also listened to that program on PBS 1036 or something with Portia, and they were talking about education last week. And it seemed like a lot of the success of the teachers that can teach in these classes are those that are able to work kind of bit more at the emotional level rather than on the content that they're teaching. So if you could maybe say something about those issues.
You pretty much said it all. I'm sure his experience was valid, the young teacher you're talking about. I think the system as a whole doesn't know what to do with a lot of kids like this. It's certainly, everyone knows it only takes one or two kids to throw a class off. It only takes a handful of kids to throw an entire school off. And the fact that he didn't get help from above, that he didn't have training on it, is a problem, but it also is a reflection of the fact that they don't know themselves what to do, I think. This is really something, I don't claim to have a lot of wisdom on it, but I just think really this requires a lot of thinking, a lot of fresh approaches, and probably a lot of resources to figure out what kind of settings to have for kids who are off track like that. So it's a huge problem. At Grand Tosa School, the one that I wrote about recently, there are kids there who really want to learn. There are kids there who are really coming from homes that are setting good values for them, but they're being overwhelmed by the kids who aren't. One of the things that's disturbing to me is where are those kids going to be next year, because they're likely not to be back in Grand Coast School. That's where kids will end up going out of the public system and going to other schools in the area that offer that kind of more nailed down classroom situations. So yes, this is, you're really speaking to huge problems, urgent problems.
I wanted to make a brief comment about charter schools. Microphone. I want to make a brief comment about charter schools that I've been very involved in because it highlights the question of leadership. That Dennis, could you introduce yourself? I'm sorry. Make sure people know who you are. Introduce yourself. Oh, excuse me. I'm Dennis Conto. So the question of leadership that Alan was talking about is so crucial, has a very impact upon charter schools in this respect. An independent charter school is run by a board of volunteer men and women. The quality of the charter school, to make Alan's point, to begin with is going to depend upon the quality of the board that runs that school. And that board, given its leadership, determines the quality of the principal. The principal in turn determines the quality of the teachers. If I were to rank charter schools, and I was head of what was called a charter school advocates, again, I think addressing a question to Alan on what's the quality of charter schools. I often thought of the 17 independent charter schools in Milwaukee in 3 categories. I'd say about a third of them are as good as any schools in the state of Wisconsin. A middle category, no better, no worse, average schools perhaps that you find in the state, and 1/3 of them, poor charter schools. What we did in that instance was to take their charters away from them incidentally. But I make the point because charter schools are not a magic bullet. That's not going to solve the problems that Alan has identified so carefully and relevantly and today. It's leadership, and leadership, in my opinion. And I'll close with this comment. I'd like on occasion to think I'm a czar and I can do whatever I want in education. My wish today as a czar is that I could spend an entire day with Alan Borsuk talking about education. Oh, yeah.
Well, thank you, but I find myself kind of boring actually. But the charter sector, I must say, and there are places in the country where the charter sector has not been very successful, but at Milwaukee, you actually have 3 different types of charter schools here: UWM, City Hall, and through MPS. The charter sector as a whole has done a better job of policing itself and doing something about its weak performance than either the private schools or MPS. MPS can go on forever not dealing with its problems. And in the voucher schools, it's amazing how many parents send their kids to schools that are just like demonstrably not doing well. And you say you're choosing to go, there really is a school choice program. No one's ever been ordered to go or assigned to go to a charter school or a voucher school. And yet people make choices that aren't very good. So, but the charter sector has done a better job of, the worst charter schools in town are generally gone. Not everybody's perfect, but someone said to me recently, well, what about Universal? And I said, Universal was a terrible story, but they're gone. And I could name others in the voucher sector. Most of the worst schools, and they were terrible. Worst schools in the voucher program 15 to 20 years ago, 20 to 25 years ago, let's say, were worse than anything in MPS. I know, I was there. I've been threatened twice in voucher schools. I mean, threatened physically. And most of them are wrong. But if someone wants to brag that the voucher program is great and MPS is bad, the record doesn't support saying that. Everybody needs it better. And the actual test scores overall between vouchers, schools, and MPS are really pretty parallel. They're not much different. There's a reading crisis. When I say there's a reading crisis in Milwaukee, I'm not saying there's a reading crisis in MPS. There's a reading crisis in Milwaukee. That includes all of the schools. So everybody's got to do. In an ideal world, everybody would do a lot better.
We have one more comment that I think we'll just see if you want to say a few words about that. I think we need to finish. This comes from Molly Schiffler. MPS has let both reading and math specialists go with further declining scores. Are there resources to replace these specialists?
I believe that what she's saying is correct. Especially if you go back, there was a point where they had a large national, I think it was National Science Foundation grant to support math specialists, and that really made a difference. There was actually a period there where things were kind of trending up a little bit in math and MPS, and they had some really excellent educators involved in doing it. I could name names. And then that slipped away. They're trying to make some improvement. I mean, I listened to the superintendent's budget presentation last week. I think filling the jobs is going to be tough. Are the resources there? Probably. They got the referendum money now. They got tons of short-term, it is very much definitely short-term pandemic money. Will it happen? A lot of it depends on filling jobs. I mean, you can declare we're going to put 10 music teachers in every school and have lots of music, but you don't have the teachers. And it's some of that's happening already. They've got jobs that they are in the budget, but they're not filling them because they don't have the people. So it's a human business, and humans aren't always rising to the occasion.
Okay, I think with that, we'd like to thank Ellen for being with us today. Live stream.